Bio 100, Chapter 35, Nerves and Nervous Systems. Well, nerves and nervous systems are extremely complex, and your book does talk about getting into how nervous systems have evolved over time and what vertebrate nervous systems look like in comparison. But you can see here, these are some images of nerve systems, essentially, and neurons. And it's crazy. They look like art pieces. And if you ever have the opportunity to see anything like this, like if you've ever seen, what's that called, where they have the bodies and they have all the skin removed, it's like an art, oh my gosh, I can't think of it. But anyways, seeing all the nerves and blood vessels and things like that, it really is like a crazy art piece. That's insane that we have that. And again, the nervous system has really evolved from really simple invertebrates all the way up to humans. And as it's evolved over time, it's gotten more complex and larger for the most part. But we are going to be focusing on humans. Okay, so our nervous system is divided into two. We have a central nervous system, or a CNS, and then we have a peripheral nervous system, or a PNS. So our central nervous system is the brain and spinal cord. It lies in the midline of the body. And then our peripheral nervous system has all of our cranial nerves and spinal nerves that essentially gather information from sensors and then decide what needs to be done about that. So if we receive sensory input, like if we touch something cold, then we want to move our hand away. Or if we touch something hot, we want to move our hand away. This is all of the nerves that lie outside of our central nervous system. And our nervous system has three specific functions. 1, it receives sensory input. 2, it performs integration. And 3, it generates motor output. So like I said, let's say that you accidentally put your hand onto a hot stove, right? We're receiving sensory input from sensory neurons that might be in our fingers. Those are running up and telling our central nervous system, so we're going from the peripheral nervous system up to the central nervous system, integrating that information, and then our brain's going, oh, okay, there's something really hot there. And then generating a motor output, sending it back to our peripheral nervous system and saying, move your hand. Now, that sounds like it would take quite a bit of time, so you can imagine the way you react to putting your hand on a hot stove, how quickly you do that, how quickly this system actually works. It's crazy fast, and these things are happening in less than milliseconds, less than nanoseconds. Okay, nervous tissue. So the main thing that one of the main things that you're going to hear about within the nervous system is neurons. So those are our nerve cells. They do have a cell body that still has a nucleus. They also have these things called dendrites, which look like little trees, and those are what are receiving signals from sensory receptors. So when we put our hand on that hot stove and a sensory neuron feels it, it's going to send that signal over to another one that's going to basically synapse onto these little tree-like things. And then the neurons also have an axon, and that's what conducts our nerve impulses. It's covered by this thing called a myelin sheath, and a myelin sheath just basically allows for it to conduct these impulses faster. Okay. So a neuron is a nerve cell. Any long axon we can also call a nerve fiber. So here's an example of a neuron. Again, we have our cell body here. We also refer to that as the soma. The cell membrane lines the outside, and these tree-like structures, these are dendrites up here. This is the axon, kind of the long bridge type thing in between. This covering over it here is the myelin sheath, so that's what makes impulses go a little bit faster, but the whole thing isn't myelinated because that actually doesn't make it go as fast as it would if it has these little breaks in between. These breaks in between the myelin sheath are called node of Ranvier, and that actually, we'll talk about it later, but allows action potentials to jump, and so it actually goes much faster than if it were all myelinated. And these neurons do contain organelles like many other eukaryotic cells. So we have a nucleus and a mitochondria in here. but they also have these dendrites and these axons that no other nerve cell, or no other cell has, sorry. Okay, so there are different types of neurons within our nervous system. We have motor neurons. So these are also commonly referred to as efferent neurons. Let me write that down here in a second. But efferent means out, right? So these, this is an E. I know it's really, oh my gosh, this thing is not working very well. Okay, so efferent or efferent, it's another E. Sorry guys, this is the worst way to try to write this here. Efferent or efferent neurons. So it means, I always think of F like EFF, so like get the F out. These ones are going outside. They're sending nerve impulses from the central nervous system to your muscles or your glands. So this is our neuron that comes from our brain and says, oh my gosh, move your hand, it's hot, right? Our sensory neurons are also sometimes called afferent. So I'm just going to write the prefix for it. But this one's AFF. So these are really close, but you will see them in some videos and things like that. So afferent is going in, efferent or efferent getting the F out. Okay. So our afferent neurons or our sensory neurons are the ones that are taking that impulse from our sensory receptors. So when we feel that hot thing and sending it up to the brain and the central nervous system. Then we have these things called interneurons. So this is within the brain or the central nervous system, and these are the ones that are sending impulses to each other, basically. So we go from sensory to interneurons to motor neurons. And then there's four main types according to number and placement of axons and dendrites. Not too worried about you knowing where all of these exist. Just know that there are different types. We have a unipolar, bipolar, multipolar, and pseudo-unipolar neuron. And again, these exist in different parts of the central nervous system and peripheral nervous system, essentially performing different functions. But I'm not too worried about you knowing each one of those. Just know that they do exist in different capacities. There is also a diversity in size and shape, and again, the structure and the function are linked. So we have pyramidal cells in the cerebral cortex, Purkinje cells in the cerebellar cortex, olfactory neurons. So these are in our olfactory system, which is our nose, our smelling system, right? So these ones are specialized to react to different smells. And then we'll go over what your cerebrum does in the different cells in that a little bit later. Okay, so other than neurons, our nerve cells, we also have these things called glial cells. Glial cells are actually way more prevalent in the nervous system. They outnumber neurons about 10 to 1 in the brain. And they kind of seem like the supporting cast compared to neurons. And there's been a lot of research lately, and I say lately, like maybe the last 20 years, that has really kind of suggested that these guys are more of the main players than we think they are. And they have several different jobs. They have several different types of glial cells, but they support, protect, and nourish our neurons. They fulfill many vital functions, and they can even cause things like brain tumors if there's a mutation within the glial cells as well. So in our central nervous system, the brain and spinal cord, we have four different types here. We have oligodendrocytes. Oligodendrocytes, if you saw on that neuron diagram, you saw on the myelin sheath there was these little circles on the outside of it. Those were oligodendrocytes, and they're the ones that form the myelin sheath around the axons. We also have these things called astrocytes. They're the ones that provide nutrients and structural support. Ependymal cells, these ones actually produce cerebrospinal fluid, and that's what cushions our neurons. So this is within, again, the brain and the spinal cord. You've probably heard of cerebrospinal fluid or CSF, and that's something that helps us protect our brain and spinal cord, essentially, among some other functions. And then last, in the central nervous system, we have microglia. These scavenge pathogens and dead cells. So it's basically kind of like, almost like a cleanup crew here. And then within our peripheral nervous systems, we have Schwann cells. These ones are the ones forming the myelin sheath in the peripheral nervous system. And then we also have satellite cells. These ones are providing nutrients and structural support to neurons. So keep in mind we have different neurons in our peripheral and central nervous system, but they do have very similar functions. I said neurons, but different glial cells within each one, but they do have similar functions. Just remember where they exist and what their functions are. Okay, so for neurons to communicate with each other, they have to have a charged cellular membrane. So this is a little bit different than other parts of the body, other systems, but the way that they signal each other is possible because there's a voltage difference between the inside and the outside of the membrane. And the charge of this membrane can change really quickly, and it can change by releasing things called neurotransmitters. And there's several different, probably almost 100 different types of neurotransmitters that all have different functions and perform different functions within our nervous system as well. But when we release those, then we are changing the membrane potential, and then we can trigger things like action potentials, which we'll talk about here in a second. So looking at our membrane, we have our phospholipid membrane here, right? We have the water-loving on the outside and the water-hating on the inside. And we also have these things embedded in the membrane that are channels, ways for things to get in and out. And these ones are actually voltage gated, which means that as the voltage changes, this will open and close to allow different things inside. These ones specifically are voltage gated sodium or Na plus channels. So as the voltage changes, it's going to allow sodium to go in and out. So you can see when we are at resting potential, the channel is closed here. So resting potential is actually usually about negative 70 millivolts or MV, which means that the inside of the cell, and here in the cytoplasm, this is at negative 70 compared to the outside of the cell, which is full of all these positive or cations. These ones are making it positive outside here, and so we are negative at resting. And then in response to a nerve impulse, the gate is going to open, and then we're going to have sodium enter the cell. And then we do also go through a period of inactivation that's pretty brief, but it follows the activation, and the channel doesn't open in response to any sort of new signal. So again, these voltage-gated ion channels are just regulating the relative concentrations of different ions inside and outside the cell, in this case sodium. And the difference in total change or total charge between the inside and outside of the cell is what we call the membrane potential. So again, our membrane potential at resting is about negative 70 millivolts. So more negative than the outside. And again, this number can vary by neuron type or by species, but for humans, generally, anywhere from like negative 65 to negative 70 is pretty standard to hear. And this resting membrane potential is created and maintained by increasing the concentration of cations, which is like the sodium plus ions, outside of the cell within the extracellular fluid relative to the inside of the cell, which is in the cytoplasm. The negative charge within the cell is created by the cell membrane being more permeable to potassium ion movement than it is to sodium ion movement. So potassium is also a positive ion or a cation, but it's less positive than the sodium ion is. Okay, so you've been hearing about this thing called an action potential. Maybe you've learned about it before, but an action potential is an all or nothing event. And basically, it's how we send information through different nerve cells or different neurons throughout our body. And it's when we get a stimulus from a sensory cell, so remember our afferent neurons or maybe another neuron too, what it does is it depolarizes the target neuron to its threshold potential. This part is really kind of confusing, especially if you haven't learned about action potentials before. I would really recommend watching the video posted on La Lima as like an animation, or watching the animation, I think, in your book as well. But it's easier to see this as an animation and understand what depolarizing, repolarizing, all that stuff means. But basically, depolarizing means that we are going to open up our potassium channels within the axon hillock, which is like that little space in between the cell body and the axon, and we're going to allow all these positive ions to enter the cell. So we went from negative to positive now, so we're depolarizing, and then it's going to change that membrane potential from that negative 70 to a positive 40. Okay. And again, action potentials are all or nothing. So once you reach this, that means they're going. The neuron's completely depolarized, and the cell is going to have to reset afterwards. So this is going to send that action potential over so that it can go to the next neuron. And then there's kind of a refractory period where it has to kind of simmer down and reset its membrane voltage back to the resting potential. So you can't have one action potential right after another, or you can, but they don't go immediately. There is some sort of refractory period where you're getting the action potential, or the membrane to repolarize and go back to its negative 70 where it, normally stays. Okay, so again, the soma here, this is the axon hillock, and then this is the axon, and then the axon terminal, right? And basically these guys are just lined up. So on the other side here, on the axon terminal, you just have another cell body here, or a neuron cell body that has these little trees, these dendrites, and they're going to receive whatever is coming off of the axon terminal here, whatever message that we're sending. So once we get a signal like, ouch, the stove is really hot, the soma end of the axon is going to become depolarized. So now we're opening up those sodium channels, all that sodium is flowing in, and it's becoming positive, and then it's going to keep spreading down the axon while it goes. This part now is repolarizing, so it's going back to its resting potential and getting more negative again. But it's doing that because the potassium channels now are inactivated, and then we're just going to keep activating them as we keep moving down this axon. And it continues all the way down, and again, it's repolarizing and then eventually getting back to resting on this side. So there is that refractory period. It is taking some time, but again, remember, all these things happen really, really fast. If you think about the time it takes you to move your hand from a hot stove, that's a really quick reaction, and that's just one example, but there's millions of other examples of how quickly our nervous system is working and how fast our reflexes are. And so you can imagine how fast these things are happening and how fast really this refractory period goes. Okay, so at the end of that, where you saw the axon terminal, there is a chemical synapse, and that just means that basically this is where we're sending the signals. They're leaving that part of it and going on to the next neuron. And what's happening is we opened up the sodium channels, but now this depolarization is also causing these voltage gating calcium channels to open. And those calcium ions are initiating a signaling cascade that causes synaptic vesicles, which are the ones that contain our neurotransmitter molecules. Then those are fusing with a presynaptic membrane, and that is causing these neurotransmitters to be released into what we call the synaptic cleft. So basically the signal is saying, hey, we want these neurotransmitters to be released, and then they're going through that process, releasing, and then once that neurotransmitter is removed from the synaptic cleft, the postsynaptic membrane can be reset again, and then it's ready to receive another signal. So we see our neuron here, right? And we have our little trees, and they're synapsing onto a terminal from another axon or from another neuron. And at the end of this is our presynaptic cleft, this is our axon terminal here, and it has synaptic vesicles in here, and then synaptic cleft is just the space in between one terminal and then these dendrites here on the other side of another neuron, and this is the postsynaptic neuron. So you can see here the action potential is arriving at the axon terminal, and then we have all these voltage-gated calcium channels opening. All of these guys, all these calciums are entering the axon terminal, and that makes these little things, the synaptic vesicles that have our neurotransmitters, it's going to make them open up and release all of their neurotransmitters, which are going to come out here into the synaptic cleft and bind to ligand-gated ion channels. So basically we're releasing all of our neurotransmitters, and then they're going to be attracted to this side. We're going to go jump over to the next neuron, and when that happens, we're going to bind to a different channel that'll let us in, basically, and then we're going to do whatever it is that neurotransmitter does, whether it's like dopamine or something like that. Whatever it is, we're sending that in there. It's going to do its thing, and then once it's done, it's going to close up again and be ready to take on any other new neurotransmitters that might come. Again, I know that might be kind of a confusing process. There's only so much I can do in terms of animation on here. So I would recommend watching that video, or even finding another video if you don't like the Amoeba Sisters. I like them just because they really simplify things and they make it kind of fun. But there's crash course videos that are also really good. Lots of other videos. So feel free to watch those on how action potentials originate, what they're actually doing, and how we're transferring chemical synapses across the axon terminal to the postsynaptic neuron, going to the dendrites on another neuron, basically. Okay, so now that we know how we communicate, we're going to go back to a little bit more of the structure. So heading back into our central nervous system, our CNS, where we have our brain and spinal cord, they are actually wrapped in 3 protective membranes, which we call the meninges. And then the spaces between all of these meninges are filled with that CSF, that cerebral spinal fluid. So remember, that's kind of cushioning it and making sure it's really protected. And we want that for our brain and spinal cord because these guys are obviously really important to us. They do a lot of different things. And our brain, well, our neurons in general, when you, let's backtrack a second. When you, let's say you touch that hot stove and your skin is all burnt there, is that something that's going to last forever? Or is your skin going to always be burnt? You might have a scar or something, right? But you're still going to eventually lose those dead cells and then regenerate new ones. And that's because our skin cells are constantly regenerating. They're really easy to regenerate. The opposite is true for our neurons, though. Neurons are not easy to regenerate, and we pretty much don't regenerate any of them. Sometimes there's a few of them that we won't really go into here, but for the most part, you can take with you that we have little to no cell regeneration in the nervous system. So because of that, when you hit your head really hard, when you're concussed, when you have a brain injury, those things are usually permanent because we can't fix them. We can't generate new cells to make it go away. Those end up being permanent. So we want to protect this as much as we can, which is why we have these meninges filled with cerebral spinal fluid. And that fluid is continuous with that of a central canal of the spinal cord and the ventricles of the brain. Okay, so whenever you see ventricles, basically, they're also just fluid filled, again, for some more cushioning. You can see the spinal cord here. Spinal cord has 2 different functions. One, it's a center for lots of different reflex actions, and then it's also a means of communication between the brain and all of your spinal nerves. And it has this thing called gray matter as well as white matter. And the gray matter has unmyelinated fibers, so unmyelinated axons that give it its color, and then the white matter actually is full of interneurons running in tracks that are all myelinated, so they makes it look like it's white, and that's what gives it its color, and that's where we take the name from. Okay, so just a quick reflex arc showing the path of a signal reflex. So now let's say you have a pin that's stuck to your skin or you step on something. There is a sensory receptor there in the skin, and that is going to cause an action potential, send it up the axon of a sensory neuron, and then it's going to eventually synapse onto interneurons in the brain that are receiving that information, and then passing that information on to a motor neuron, which is then sending out the information to motor neurons within your muscles, or effectors. These are the ones getting the job done, that say, okay, move your hand away from that pin, or that your foot, or whatever it is. Okay, so let's get into your brain as well. What parts make up the brain and what do they do? So in humans, the cerebrum is the largest portion of our brain, and it has quite a few jobs. It communicates with and coordinates activities of all the other parts of the brain, and it has this longitudinal fissure here that's just dividing it into the left and the right cerebral hemispheres. And you'll hear things like, oh, your left brain or your right brain, based on how you act and stuff. And it's because you have different parts of your brain that are responsible for different things. You know, different communication. Some things are more creative, some things are more analytical thinking, and we won't get into that too much, but the cerebrum here, this is the main part of your brain that's connecting with and coordinating everything within the brain. Here's just a side view of the brain. You can see the cerebrum up here, and it is subdivided into different parts as well. This is the telencephalon, and then you have the diencephalon. There's different parts of it. I wouldn't worry about that part too much, but you can see these ventricles. Again, these are the parts that are fluid filled. You have the third ventricle, the fourth ventricle here. And then we can see the spinal cord coming up here into our, we call this like the hindbrain essentially. It goes into our medulla oblongata, followed by the pons, and then up here is the midbrain. And then we have our little cerebellum over here. And again, you can see these different meninges filled with cerebral spinal fluid in between that are protective layers so that our brain is well cushioned in the event that we have sudden head trauma or something like that. And then we have the skull, obviously, is also a pretty hard layer to get through. Okay, so in the cerebral cortex, you can see that as we become more complex, as we evolve, the brain or the cerebral cortex is getting larger, and it is thin, but it's a highly convoluted outer layer of gray matter. So you can see your brains look all wrinkly, and that's kind of increasing the surface area of how much gray matter we have there. And these are covering the cerebral hemispheres. Again, the cerebral cortex, it contains motor areas and sensory areas as well as association areas. And then we have different lobes of the cerebral hemisphere. So we have the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and then the temporal lobe. Okay. So frontal lobe here is primary motor area. This is like speech, things like that. Parietal lobe over here, this is somatosensory, taste, general interpretation. Occipital lobe, this is actually mostly our visual, visual association area, how we see. And then we do have some parts like sensory speech is up here. Temporal lobe, this is our auditory area. So how are we hearing things? And then we have, different things like face, tongue, hand, arm, trunk, leg. And the reality is that neurons responsible for these different functions or for these different body parts are really spread well throughout the whole brain, but there are certain areas of the brain that are more responsible than others. Okay, going back to that diencephalon, this is the region encircling the third ventricle, and it also contains the hypothalamus and the thalamus, if you've heard of these guys before. The hypothalamus controls our endocrine system, which we're going to be going over soon. This is like all of our hormones. It's basically our thermostat for our body so that our body can thermoregulate itself and maintain homeostasis, meaning we don't get too hot or too cold when we do certain things. So our hypothalamus is telling us, hey, maybe you need to start sweating because you're getting too hot, or maybe you need to start shivering because you're getting too cold. And it's doing this via something called the pituitary gland. We also have the thalamus within the diencephalon, and this has two masses of gray matter located in the sides and roof of the third ventricle, and this is the gateway to and from the cortex. The pineal gland is also in the diencephalon. This secretes something called melatonin, which is essentially what helps you get to sleep and hopefully stay asleep. And then moving on from the cerebral cortex and our diencephalon, we have our cerebellum. So that was that little chunk that you saw kind of almost like closer to the bottom of the brain, if you will. But this is what is receiving sensory input from your eyes, ears, joints, muscles, and then it's sending those motor impulses out the brainstem to our skeletal muscles, so our voluntary muscles, basically. And it is also responsible for balance and coordination. So it has a ton of stuff to do. And then within our brainstem, this is what's connecting essentially the brain to the spinal cord. We have the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla, or the medulla oblongata. Midbrain is a relay station for tracks passing between the cerebrum and the spinal cord, or the cerebellum. The pons, that little kind of circular part of the brainstem, this guy helps regulate your breathing and head movements. And then the medulla also contains reflex centers for vomiting, coughing, sneezing, hiccuping, swallowing. Lots of reflexes that we have to, if we're sick or if something happens or something's really gross or we're allergic or something like that. Okay, so then in the peripheral nervous system, so remember these are all the nerves going out of our central nervous system. These are doing things like moving our skeletal muscles, etc., can be divided into two different systems. So we have the somatic system and the autonomic nervous system. Autonomic nervous system is kind of like, it kind of sounds like automatic, and this one is the one that controls smooth muscles, cardiac muscles, and glands. So this is one that we're not aware of its actions. So this is automatically happening for us. It's automatically breathing. We're automatically having our heart beat. Our digestive system is working. All of those things. That's part of the autonomic system. And then the autonomic system is further subdivided into two different divisions. So we have sympathetic and parasympathetic. Sympathetic is our fight or flight, and parasympathetic is our rest and digest. We'll get into that in just a second. So autonomic, this is our automatic control over everything, right? We don't have to do anything. It's unconscious. Those things are happening. Whereas the somatic system, this is our cranial nerves and spinal nerves, and it gathers info from our sensors and then conducts decisions to the effectors, or the ones carrying out, let's say, the movement. So this is what controls our skeletal muscles. This is what says, hey, move your hand from that hot stove, or hey, I want to do bicep curls, or whatever it might be. So we are conscious of the activity happening here versus the autonomic system where it's doing it on its own. But again, we have sympathetic and parasympathetic. So cranial and spinal nerves, just so you can kind of see here, you can see the eyes here. We see the frontal lobe, the olfactory bulb. So this is where we're sensing different smells, leading into this thing called the olfactory tract to going into, I believe, the midbrain actually. And then we have the optic nerve here coming from your eyes, this optic chiasm. So all of these things are essentially responsible for sensing, whatever it might be of our five senses. And then you can see what our spinal cord looks like here with our vertebra in between. That's also, again, protecting it. And then what the central canal looks like with the gray matter surrounding it, and then all the white matter here. That's just our myelinated nerve fibers. Okay, so we talked about the autonomic system, again, having basically involuntary control, making all of our internal organs work, and they're utilizing two neurons and one ganglion for each impulse. This is basically just a ganglion, or a ganglia is the plural, is basically just like a center for all of these neurons and things like that. But again, we're subdivided into sympathetic division, which is fight or flight. So this is what will accelerate your heartbeat, dilate your bronchi, things like that tell you, okay, are we going to run or are we going to fight? All right. So like if you see a bear or something like that. Parasympathetic, this is actually your rest and digest. So this is promoting digestion. It calms down your heartbeat, and it's promoting all of those internal responses that are associated with a relaxed state. We can see this is a good figure here that tells us kind of generally what everything's doing. So we have our central nervous system, brain, and spinal cord, and then we have peripheral here, and we have both the parasympathetic and the sympathetic division. So parasympathetic, you can see, like, constricts pupils, while sympathetic, our fight or flight, would dilate them. Dilates bronchi, inhibits stomach mobility and secretion, inhibits intestinal motility, relaxes your bladder, whereas this will contract your bladder, can stimulate intestinal motility, those kind of things, right? So parasympathetic versus sympathetic, whether we have rest and digest or whether we have fight or flight. Okay, so now getting into a little bit more of the things that can go wrong in our nervous system. This is what your discussion post is about this week, is posting about some nervous system disorder. It doesn't have to be necessarily a neurodegenerative disorder like Parkinson's or Alzheimer's that we'll talk about here in a second. It could also be talking about something like autism, which is like a neurodevelopmental disorder. Or even if you want to take on something like drug abuse, you could potentially go into that, though that might be a little bit harder. I would probably recommend sticking with neurodevelopmental or neurodegenerative diseases or disorders. But if you've known someone or if you've struggled with drug abuse, or really any sort of addiction, it doesn't just have to be a drug that's like, say, a hard drug. You could have this with caffeine as well. And it's because your brain is essentially wired for it, right? Drug abuse is just a person taking a drug at a level that increases the potential of a harmful effect. And they're doing that because they're addicted. And when more of the drug is needed to get the same effect, then you just keep getting addicted to it and keep wanting more and more. If you are to stop taking the drug, you're going to go through something called withdrawal. And alcohol, drugs, tobacco, all of these can cause addiction, right? And again, drugs don't necessarily have to just be like cocaine or heroin. It could be caffeine or, fentanyl. Like, there's so many different things now. But all of these things can adversely affect, obviously, you, but also if you are pregnant, developing embryo, fetus, or newborn as well. And that is what causes some of those neurodevelopmental disorders as well, like potentially going into autism or things like that. Not always the case. There's several different things that can go wrong if you're pregnant and on drugs or alcohol, but that does lead into it. You can see what your brain looks like before and after cocaine. Before cocaine, your brain is not too active, right? It's got some states of rest, some states of being a little bit more active. You can see brain activity here. So the blue and purple is really active. After you take cocaine, your brain is super active. It's like on hyperdrive, which isn't good for it over long periods of time either. Okay, other neurodegenerative disorders, we have Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's is really sad, right? It's basically an advanced form of dementia. You can see a normal brain here on the left compared to an Alzheimer's brain over here. And basically, we're just starting to chip away at the white matter. Your brain is shrinking, and you're seeing all this neurodegeneration happening, especially within the ventricles and the hippocampus, which the hippocampus is mostly associated with memory, which is why if you have Alzheimer's patients, those people have a really hard time remembering things and putting together associations and things like that. And Alzheimer's is usually pretty late in life, but there are some genes associated with Alzheimer's, and it is possible to get it earlier on in life, which is probably also different genes associated with that. But Alzheimer's is basically an advanced form of dementia. There's also Parkinson's. Parkinson's, if you've heard about it, you can research it if you haven't, but they sometimes have a characteristic hunched walk, or they're kind of shaking a lot. And these guys also have degeneration of the brain, and they also have all these kind of clumps of things called Lewy bodies. Alzheimer's also has abnormal clumps within the brain. So just a couple examples of something that you could use for your discussion board this week, but so many other examples, different kinds of dementia that you could go into. I had a family friend that had semantic dementia, which basically meant that he couldn't form words or put together words anymore. That one's pretty interesting, very sad, but lots of different things you can go into. It's something that you're interested in or that you maybe is affecting friends or family. Please put in some effort into talking about something that interests you in the discussion board related to nervous system disorders or diseases. And hopefully you enjoyed learning more about your brain and all of the neurons within your body.